Okay, hello and welcome to part 2 of the second lecture. So I'd like to carry on with the PowerPoint, and in this section, it's quite a dense section. I want us to think about the ways in which a particular group of witches represented themselves and or were represented by others. And these are the witches that attacked King James, or so he thought and so others thought, in Scotland in the 1580s. This is really important. It's a series of events that starts in 1589. King James is a vulnerable monarch, and he wants to be married, he wants to secure his line. So he goes to Denmark to secure a royal wife, Anne of Denmark, as she then becomes when she comes to Britain, by whom he hopes to have children, which indeed he does. Throughout the course of 1589 and 1590, this couple experience serious troubles. And among the troubles they experience are difficulties getting home. They embark on a journey around Europe, and one of the things that happens to them is that they're trapped in different places during part of that journey. And the king cannot get home. He can't get to his wife to marry her. They have about 4 different wedding ceremonies in different places. They have to be married by proxy at one point because they can't get to the same place as each other. Sounds oddly familiar now, doesn't it? People who can't connect with each other and can't get together. In those days, they can't have a virtual wedding, so they panic. They get into all sorts of difficulties with proxy weddings and postponed activities. And finally, they get married again, properly in person. And James brings his new queen home. But there are storms on those voyages. That's why they can't get to each other. They have to cross the seas, and they have to do it in particularly dangerous and leaky wooden vessels. And they are frightened. They are anxious for their own lives and for the lives of the children that they will bear if they can only get together, and for the future of James's realm. So it's an important series of events, and the things that they think are holding them back are magical things. They think that witches have attacked them, have caused those sea storms, have caused them to be apart, are scheming against them getting together, are trying to keep them barren, are trying to damage the kingdom, are trying to stop them creating that stable royal line that Scotland needs. And those people are witches. They think that witches are trying to do that to them at the behest of James's key enemy, one of his royal cousins, and somebody who could potentially be king were James to fail to produce an heir or indeed be killed. And this is the Earl of Bothwell. So go and look him up. He's a really interesting character. He's accused and throughout history is often represented as being at the head of a coven of witches in this period. I think it's very unlikely indeed, but it is entirely likely that people were intrigued against the royal couple by witchcraft and magic. There's lots of practice of it at the Scottish court. People are often finding love philters, they're often finding stolen goods through the use of invocations. It does appear that people are particularly interested in fairy beliefs of one kind or another. In that sense, the world of Macbeth, which is, a world set in the early medieval period in Scottish history, we'll come back to the source for Macbeth later on in this lecture, but that world of early medieval Scotland in Macbeth is very like Jacobean Scotland in the late 16th and early 17th century. It's a magical place. Have a look then at what is said about some of these witches and what they are said to have said about themselves. This first slide is about a witch from North Berwick. This is where the main body of witches was said to be based. And it's Agnes Sampson or Thompson. This pamphlet was published in 1591, and this is what Agnes was said to have confessed about herself and the king. She confessed that upon the night of All Hallows Eve, so that's Halloween, witches were associated with Halloween even then, she was accompanied as well with the persons aforesaid, and these are other people that she's named as witches, as also with a great many other witches, to the number of 200, and that all they together went by sea, each one in a riddle or sieve. There's something that comes up in Macbeth, isn't it? And went to the same very substantially with flagons of wine, making merry and drinking by the way, in the same riddles or sieve, to the kirk, the church, in Scottish dialect, of North Berwick in Lothian. And that after they had landed, they took hands on the land, and dance this reel or short dance, so a Scottish reel, a dance of a particular localised kind, singing all with one voice. And this is what they sang. She says, comma, go ye before, comma, go ye. If ye will not go before, comma, let me. Comma is friend or comrade. It's a calling to somebody else in the dance to go ahead, and to make figures in the dance to go ahead of the speaker. At which time she confessed that this Gillis Duncan, this is somebody else who is involved in the witchcraft supposedly, and who has been questioned as a witch, did go before them playing this reel or dance upon a small trump called a Jew's trump, which we would now call a Jew's harp, until they entered into the kirk of North Berwick. These confessions made the king, and he was there. He was present when these women were tortured, which they were, and when they were questioned, which they were. And a man is also questioned, a Dr. Fian, a schoolmaster. He's present when these people are being horribly maltreated and accused of witchcraft, and he becomes wonderfully admiring of this. That doesn't mean that he admired the witches, that means that he is amazed, he's excited, he's engaged by what they are saying. Well, this is fascinating, he says. And sent for the said Gillis Duncan, James did, who upon the said trump, the like trump, did play the said dance before the king's majesty, who in respect of the strangeness of these matters took great delight to be present at their examinations. That's a nasty phrase, isn't it? That's one that haunts James's biographers. He took great delight to be present at their examinations. Yes, no doubt he was interested in witchcraft. He was interested in demons and the theory of demons, as in his book Demonology, written later on. But it's not a nice thing, is it, to take delight in being present at the examinations by, in this case, torture, this being used in Scotland in the period, of these poor people who are accused of witchcraft. Some of the themes of their confessions are important. So once we've set up the initial picture, once Agnes has explained what she was supposedly up to with her companions when they go to this demonic dance and revel in the church of North Berwick, she starts to talk about why they're doing it. And one of the themes that she comes up with in the course of this discussion, or perhaps her questioners come up before her more likely, is the idea of the devil versus the priest and the king, on the other hand. This had Agnes Thompson confessed that the devil, being then at North Berwick Church or Kirk, attending their coming in the habit or likeness of a man, and seeing that they tarried over long, he at their coming enjoined them all to a penance, which was that they should kiss his buttocks in sign of duty to him, which being put over the pulpit bar, everyone did as he had enjoined them, and having made his ungodly exhortations, wherein he did greatly inveigh against the King of Scotland, he received their oaths for their good and true service towards him, and departed, which done they returned to sea and so home again. At which time the witches demanded of the devil why he did bear such hatred to the king, who answered, by reason the king is the greatest enemy he hath in the world. All which their confessions and depositions are still extant upon record. The devil identifies the king as a godly man, somebody who's set against him. So if he is the devil, then the king is a God-given, a God-chosen, a godly figure, somebody who is his exact opposite. In the Stuart Clark article, you'll see that discussion of binaries going on, of inversions. The king is God's chosen monarch. He is divinely ordained. He is on the sides of priests and God. He is a good man. He is a good figure for everybody to emulate. The devil is his inverse, his exact opposite. And one of the ways that we can see this is that the devil asked the witches to kiss the wrong end of his body. And he's up in the pulpit of the church, so he's mimicking, he's parodying, he's echoing a minister speaking from the pulpit, exhorting the congregation in a godly sermon, or a king speaking from a throne. And what he's doing is hanging his bottom over the pulpit bar so that these people can kiss it, and then preaching to them about how they should do evil, about how the king is bad, about how they should do all these inverted things. And he receives their oaths, just as a king would, just as a churchman would. They are allowed to swear allegiance to him rather than the king. This is an inversion of the norm here. So think about that in the context of not only the text that you've been reading already on the course of this lecture, but also Macbeth. How far are we looking at kings and anti-kings? How far are we looking at the devil versus God? How far are we looking at a godly monarch like the King of England, who we see in Macbeth, as against an ungodly monarch who we see in Macbeth himself? Where does Malcolm sit on all of this? Could go either way. The final theme is of regicide. That comes up in Macbeth, of course, doesn't it? It is the classic play of killing the king. Agnes Thompson says, supposedly, that she is the only woman, she is the one, who by the devil's persuasion should have intended and put in execution the King's Majesty's death in this manner. She confessed that she took a black toad and did hang the same up by the heels 3 days, and collected and gathered the venom as it dropped and fell from it in an oyster shell. Compare this with the kind of magic, the kind of sorcery done with items, particularly disgusting or problematic or poisonous items in Macbeth. And she kept the same venom close covered till she should obtain any part or piece of foul linen cloth that had appertained to the King's Majesty, as shirt, handkerchief, napkin, or any other thing which she practised to obtain by means of one John Kerrs, who, being attendant in his Majesty's chamber, desired him for old acquaintance between them to help her to one or a piece of such a cloth as is aforesaid, which thing the said John Kerrs denied to help her to, saying he could not help her to it. There's somebody, a spy, somebody who could betray the king in the king's chamber. Think about Duncan being betrayed in his chamber. There are echoes here. Macbeth seems to be feeding off this text. So he said he couldn't. John Kerrs gets himself in the clear here by saying that he couldn't help her to it. But she has some more plans. Moreover, she confessed that at the time when His Majesty was in Denmark, she, be accompanied with the parties before specially named, took a cat and christened it, and afterwards bound to each part of that cat the chiefest parts of a dead man. She's doing exactly the things that the Witchcraft Act forbids her. Moreover, she's blasphemously christening an animal which is thought not to have a soul, and she, a woman, should not be performing that christening ceremony in the first place. So she binds to the cat the chiefest parts of the dead man, several joints of his body, and in the night following the said cat was conveyed into the midst of the sea by all these witches sailing in their riddles or sieves, as is aforesaid, and so left the cat right before the town of Leith in Scotland. This done, there did arise such a tempest. That's an interesting key word for Shakespeare, isn't it, bearing in mind that he writes The Tempest, his play, later on. A greater hath not been seen, and the said christened cat was the cause that the King's Majesty's ship at his coming forth of Denmark had a contrary wind to the rest of his ships, and further, the said witch declared that His Majesty had never come safely from the sea if his faith had not prevailed above their intentions. James falls in with the narrative that supposedly the devil originates in this piece. He feels that his faith has saved him. This poor woman confessing and probably responding to leading questions by her interrogators confirms that the king is a very faithful man. He's kept safe because of his faith. The devil cannot harm him. So just go back over those sections. It's quite dense, this part of the lecture, but go back over the slides and think about the images that you see here, and have a look at exercise 2, which prompts you in that way. As it suggests, many of the themes and specific images from News from Scotland recur in Macbeth. An example I've given you is of witches sailing in sieves, which is a very distinctive one, and that I think does prove quite fairly that Shakespeare knew this story. Think about what are the similarities and the direct echoes. Discuss this amongst yourselves and make some notes with key act, scene and line references. But also, are there any changes? Is there anything different? Does Macbeth do anything different with that story of News from Scotland and the literary imagery that this witch uses in her confession? In the next part of the lecture, we'll also move on to look at some other sources that turn up in Macbeth that have influenced and shaped the play of Macbeth.